talk that has probably reverberated, or not just the talk, but this subject has reverberated right across the world because of what happened on June 8th with that infamous interview between Muhammad Hijab and Dr. Yasser Qadhi. And what's fascinating is that that interview has now been deleted. You will not see that interview on either of their sites because of the reaction and because the reverberations that are happening around the world. But to understand that interview, you need to really go back in 2016 to Speaker's Corner, to where we were back in 2016. I don't know if any of you have seen the video. We have it up on Fander Films. Hatun and I were down at Speaker's Corner. She had gone around was in North Africa, went into a store in North Africa. She was teaching and asked for a Quran, and the man behind the counter said, well, which one? And that kind of floored her. And she says, what do you mean, which one? And he says, well, we have the Warsh, we have the Hafs, we have the Qalun, we have the Ibn Asim. And then he started listing about 5 or 6 different Qurans. And she said, well, give me all of them. And she brought them back to London with her, showed them to me. And I kind of laughed because I had no idea that these Qurans, these are what we know as QIRA'ATS, were still being published today. I thought that they had all been destroyed back when they chose the Hafs as the canonical text almost 100 years ago. And here she was showing me 5 or 6 of them. So she decided to start collecting them. And by 2016, she had collected 26 of these Qurans. And so we decided to take them down to Speaker's Corner and just to show them to people, because this is the reference that you hear over and over again, the narrative that you hear from all Muslims, whether they are radical, whether they are moderate, whether they are well, maybe not the liberals. Let's don't include the liberals because they've already given up on the Quran. But 99.9% of all Muslims have one narrative, and that is the Quran is preserved, that it is eternal, that it has never changed, that God guards it, and that therefore every word that we see in the Quran today, this little guy here, I keep him small because for a reason, this Quran that's in the Arabic, every word, every letter is exactly the same here as that which exists in heaven, that which was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, and that which was then canonized or then put together by Uthman in 652. That's the narrative, and you've all heard it, and I'm sure none of you have ever disputed it. You've never needed to. Well, you've never tried to, because how can you dispute that kind of claim? Unless, of course, you can go right back to the very beginning. And no one can. We can't, because there's nothing there at the very beginning. Well, beginning meaning the 7th century, nothing in the 7th century to support these claims. Nonetheless, here we have these 26 Qurans. And as we held them up, you could see the reaction, and you can look at the video. It's up on Fander Films. Take a look at it. Look at the action of the Muslims. They were throwing things at us. They were yelling at us. Finally, there was one tall fellow, and that was Muhammad Hijab. He was right there. When he stands, of course, he stands about 6'6", 6'7". So I was on the ladder. His head was equal to mine. He was filming me, and then he started demanding that all the Muslims leave, and he starts pulling them away. Don't listen to this. Don't listen to this. Don't look at this. Please, everybody, come away. Come to me. Come to me. He kept on saying. So he pulled all the Muslims out of the crowd to where he was. So that was in 2016. Well, you can see the difficulty. He went through a crisis of faith there because he did not want the Muslims to see what we were showing or to hear what we were saying. To say nothing of the fact when we started unpacking and started showing these slides or these what we call these type of things, where you actually put them up one by one and show the difficulty. And here's a picture of that, us holding them up. This is a picture of us holding all those Qurans up there in 2016. Now let's jump to 2020, 4 years later. This is the same Muhammad Hijab who was there in the crowd, who had pulled all the Muslims away. Now, in this interview, an hour and 45-minute interview, you don't have to watch the first hour and 16 minutes. It starts there about an hour and 16 minutes into the interview when he turns to Yasser Qadhi, and he says, what about these qira'at? What about these many different ahruf or qira'ats? Of course, he didn't know how to define ahruf. No one really does. What are we going to do about these different Qurans? And Yasser Qadhi's reaction was evident immediately. You see him react. We don't talk about this. This is something you don't talk about in public. Don't ask me this question, Muhammad. Please don't ask me this question, and not on camera, for heaven's sakes. Just take my class. Take my class. And that will be all explained there. And it was fascinating to see his body language as he refused to answer the question when Muhammad pushed him and pushed him. I'm going to hold out this is an empty book with nothing written on it. What are you going to write on it? Which one are you going to write? Which one? Is it going to be Hafs? Is it going to be Warsh? Is it going to be any of these right here? Take a look what I've got right here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 different Qurans. You can order them. I just ordered these 2 months ago. You can order them. Go up online and order these because they're available. They're still printing them. They're still publishing them, and they're still sending them out. Qadhi, who's listening right now, you're ahead of me. You have 10. I've only got 9. But here is Hafs, there is Warsh, there is Qalun, there's Ibn Amir, there's Ibn Kathir, there's Al-Duri, here is Al-Kisai, here is Shoba, and here's Khalaf. Now, what am I talking about? What are these words coming out of my mouth? These are all names of people. These are all names of people who wrote different Qurans. And every one of them that you see here on this table, every one of them is different. Not 2 are the same. Not 2 are the same. And yet this is the one that was chosen. And notice it's smaller than all the others. I keep it small for a reason. I could have put a bigger one up there, but you're going to see why after this lecture, while even this one here should not be part of this whole list. It should not even be here, and it should not be the one that was chosen at the very end, the one that we're using today. That's it, that blue one there. Well, you're going to have to see what I'm talking about. So what we want to do is we want to get into this because as we were doing this back in 2016, I was telling Hatun at that time, listen, this is not really that important. I much prefer the manuscripts, the material that I'm going to be introducing next week. I much prefer also what's happening in the 7th century, the material that we're going to be introducing in 2 weeks. Those are the kind of things I would rather talk about, not this, because this is nothing more than dots and vowels, adding 5 dots and 3 vowels. That's it. The Dhamma, the Kasra, and the Fatha, and the 5 dots. That's all this is talking about, and that was done in the 8th, 9th, and 10th century. It's much, much later. It's nothing to do with it in the 7th century. It doesn't really, we don't really think much about it because this is nothing more than men trying to decide where the dots go and where the vowels go. So this is up to human intuition. This is up to human chance or human choice. That's all it is. And we all know about this in academia. She kind of looked at me, and this is why Hatun is very valuable. Well, this is not the only reason. This is one of the reasons people like her are very valuable. She says, Jay, you still don't get it, do you? You're trying to talk like an academic. Get out of your academic robe, come down to the human level, come down to the street, and listen to what you're saying, because you have no idea who you're talking to. I used to be a Muslim, and I knew as long as I lived that there was always one narrative, there was only one Quran. Not one word, not one letter has changed. This I have been drilled into me since yay high to a grasshopper. As long as I have been able to walk and hear and speak, I have heard that there's only one Quran, that the Quran has never changed, that the Quran we have in our hand today is the same Quran that exists in heaven, the same Quran that was revealed to Muhammad, the same Quran that was canonized by Uthman, the same Quran, not one word, not one letter, even not one dot has changed since the very beginning. And you're still trying to talk like an academic. And see, that's where I didn't realize I wasn't really thinking in human terms. I wasn't really thinking in popular terms. On a popular level, what I'm going to go through today is probably the most devastating argument. This is probably the most devastating argument for any Muslim anywhere in the world at any time. This is not an academic argument we're going to get into today. This is not an academic discussion. This hits at the very root of Islam on a popular level. And that's why I needed people like Hatun Tash and others. And I needed people like Muhammad Ijab, who for 4 years, this has been stewing in his mind. He didn't know how to answer it. And that's why he went to who he thought was the greatest, the best cleric, and in many people's opinion, probably the best cleric, Muslim cleric we have in the United States today. They asked him a second time, what are you going to write there? And remember Yasir Qadhi's response. We have a reverence for the Quran. We revere it. We have a red line beyond which we don't go. Here's the red line. We don't ask these kinds of questions, Muhammad. You don't ask these kinds of questions. Not in public, not here, not on camera. You don't ask, you don't go beyond this red line. And then Muhammad said, well, what happened to you 25 years ago back in Yale University when you were taking your doctorate there? You went through a crisis of faith. And he quickly stopped and said, no, it was not a crisis of faith. It was a crisis of knowledge. Do you see the distinction he's making? My faith was still there. He still believed in tawatur and mutawatir. He still believed in the tawatur. It really is tawatur is really the idea of everybody conceding that this is ijma, this is consensus. Everybody, there's so many people that agree on this one point that it is without error. That's tawatur. That's tawatur. Sorry, in my pronunciation. And that's what he kept on saying. Oh, no, I agree that the Quran is the word of God. I believe absolutely that with every fiber of my body that it has not been changed, that God has guarded it. And that's in chapter 10, verse 15. That's in chapter 18, verse 27. That's in chapter 15, verse 9. And that's why he had to say that. He went into a mantra where he just kind of repeated it over again. I do believe, please don't hurt my unbelief. I do believe that it is complete. I do believe that it is eternal. I do believe that it has never changed. I do believe that Allah can guard it, that Allah will guard it. Therefore, if I have any unbelief, it has nothing to do with faith. It has to do with knowledge. I just didn't know enough. And here I was at Yale University, and they don't have that red line. They don't have a red line beyond which you don't go. At Yale University, you can say anything you want. Listen, he lives in the West. We live in the West. Many of us who are listening to me right now, you all live in the West. And here you can ask any question. Why? Because this has been done to the Bible. Every one of these questions has been done to this book. We have gone to this book and we have asked every question. We are the ones that really have unpacked historical criticism. There really would not be anything such as redacted criticism, all these different criticisms, source criticism, had it not been for the Bible. So we ask everything of our Bible, and we demand that people do the same. We open it up to criticism. We don't have a red line that we don't go beyond. And then he made that interesting statement. But today in the West, they're way beyond what it used to be. The scholars in the West know much more than when I was just even 25 years ago in 1995. And we have holes in our narrative. Ooh, what a thing to say. I couldn't have written the script better. If I had been there to write it for him, I couldn't have done it better. And then he went on and say, they're looking at us, that means us, those of us in the West are looking at the Muslim scholars, and they look at us as if we are the emperor with no clothes. Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're saying. And that's exactly what we see. Because now that we know what they're talking about, now we know where this is all going. And see, I didn't even know what I'm going to tell you today before June 8th. I didn't know all this. I wasn't aware of all this. Oh, I knew from my studies, yeah, that there were such a thing as Qiraat, but I had no idea just how hopeless this argument is. And that's why what we're going to do today probably is more important than probably any other lecture that I'm giving, because it hits at the very basis of everything that Muslims believe. It hits at the very foundations of all they know. It hits at the very foundations of Islam itself. Because without the Quran, revealed to a man named Muhammad, in the mid or beginning of the 7th century, there is no Islam. There is no Muhammad. Because then what's his purpose? What did he do? Who is he? Where did he come from? That's for another lecture. That's for another week. That's in 2 weeks. So let's go ahead and let's get right into the PowerPoint, because the PowerPoint, we need to go through and discuss it and unpack it. So let's go ahead and share screen. And I call it the Qiraat Conundrum. Looking at the many variant Qurans, or assessing them and trying to come to some understanding about them. So let's go ahead and let's see the 10 areas that we'll be investigating. First of all, we're going to look and see what modern Muslims leaders claim. What do they claim about the Quran? We're going to then look at the 30 diacritical variants, and we're going to define them, because we need to know what we're talking about. And then we're going to move into what we know as the 30 official variant. We're going to look at these 30 official variant Qurans. We're going to actually, we're going to define and look at them and then actually name them, how the Qiraats were formed, moving into, were there more than just 30? Look at some of the Qiraat variants. We're not going to look at too many, maybe about 10 or 11. And then comparing the Hafs and the Warsh. Those are the two most popular today. They are the most important in the world today. So we're going to spend a little bit more time on those two. And then we're going to see how the 1924 Hafs canonized text was chosen and how they did that. But then we're going to come to conclusions on all of the previous 9. So those are the 10 areas that I'm going to use today. It's a lot of material. We need to go quickly through it so that we get it in one setting or one sitting. So what do Muslims claim about the Quran? Well, number one, they would claim that it's uncreated. This we get from the Quran itself. It's in chapter 85, verse 22 on those preserved tablets that it refers to there. Every exegete of that verse says that these are the eternal tablets from which the Quran is derived. It has always existed co-eternal with God, creating a duality in and of itself. Number two, they would claim that the Quran was sent down to Muhammad between 610 and 632, though it was not written down fully. It only had been written on pieces of bone, stones, bark, and much of it had been memorized by the companions of the Prophet. We get that in Al-Bukhari, volume 6, hadith number 509. And then in hadith number 510, number 3, it says that the Quran was completed by Uthman in 652. So that the Quran we have was finally canonized in its final form. It had first been completed in 632 by Abu Bakr and Umar, but then it was then rewritten again in 652, and that was the Uthmanic recension, so 1400 years ago. Number 4, the Quran is unchanged since that period. So for the last 1400 years, since 652, there has been no change whatsoever. And we read that in the Quran itself in chapter 10, verse 15, and chapter 18, verse 27. And the reason it's unchanged is because the Quran is guarded by Allah himself. And that you see in chapter 15, verse 9. So it was finally canonized, however, in 1924 to the Hafs text that we use today. That was then made official by King Fahd in 1985, just 35 years ago. What the Quran says about its preservation, I think I've already referred to these. There is no change. No one can change it. In Surah 10, Ayah 15, it is not for me to change it on my own accord. If I were to disobey my Lord, the torment of the great day would be upon me. Also in chapter 18, verse 27, recite what has been revealed to you, O Muhammad, of the book. None can change his words, and none will you find as a refuge other than him. And then in chapter 15, verse 9, probably the most famous verse, says, verily it is we who have sent down the dhikr, that's the Quran, and surely we will guard it. That means Allah himself, in the plural form, will guard his word from corruption. So let's then let's ask, is this what modern Muslim scholars believe? Is this what they claim? Let's see what they say. Let's start with this Fethullah Gulen. Some of you have seen this before. I've used it in the past. He's an influential Turkish leader. He lives here in Pennsylvania at the moment. He is in exile from Turkey. He says the Quran's text is entirely reliable. It has not been altered or edited or tampered with since it was revealed. All Muslims know only one Quran, perfectly preserved in its original words since the Prophet's death, when revelation ended. So he's very clear that it's unaltered, unedited, and untampered. Susan Havinif, a well-known convert to Islam, maybe she doesn't know much, but she says this: a Holy Quran is the only divinely revealed scripture in the history of mankind which has been preserved to the present time in its exact original form. So preserved in an exact original form. Now, she may not know that much, but certainly this man does. Abdullah Yusuf Ali, he was the translator into English in the 1930s. The most famous translation was by him. So certainly he should know what he's talking about. What does he say? So well has it been preserved, that's the Quran, both in memory and in writing, that the Arabic text we have today is identical to the text as it was revealed to the Prophet. Not even a single letter has yielded to corruption during the passage of the centuries. So not even a single letter, very clear, not a letter. Malvi Muhammad Ali, he's a very influential Pakistan theologian for the Ahmadiyya movement, and he says this: the Quran is one, and no copy differing in even a diacritical point is met with. There are and always have been contending sects, but the same Quran is in the possession of one and all. A manuscript with the slightest variation in the text is unknown. So not even a diacritical point. How he defends that, I don't know. Nonetheless, he would say it's not just a letter, it's not just a word, not even a dot is different. Dr. Shabbat Ali doesn't say quite that much, and he's a little bit more nuanced in what he says. He talks about this Quran dating from 790 in the British Museum. That's the manuscript 2165 Codex. Notice he's dating it to 790. He doesn't date that anymore. He now dates it to the 7th century. Nonetheless, he says, folks, that's 1,300 years ago, and we can compare that with what we're reading today, and we find them to be exactly identical. So for 1,300 years, the Quran that was the Ma'il, which is the 2165, now he could say that because he hadn't really looked at it yet. He goes on and says, but what is important to notice is that throughout the age of Muslim history, the Muslims have not quarreled over what is the text of the Quran, because the text was known through memory work and through the written materials, handed down right from the time of the Prophet. As I said, the 2 copies that were made, now he says 1,400 years. So now he's going back to the 7th century. one which is in Tashkent, Russia. No, it's not in Russia. Tashkent is in Uzbekistan. Has been demonstrated by Ahmed van Denfer in his book Ulum al-Quran to be an early copy from that time, and we find no difference from that copy to what we're reading today. So that's what he is saying. Dr. Yasser Qadhi, he goes and says, Uthman standardized the copies of the Quran. From his time up until our time, there hasn't even been two copies of the Quran that are different, even one letter or one word. This is Yasser Qadhi. Remember, this is the one that had the interview 3 months ago, a little over 3 months, almost coming up to 4 months now, where he said, yes, there are many changes. And he agreed in that interview that all the Qira'at are the Quran. But look what he's saying here. The Quran is the most protected of all scriptures, and God has protected his Quran from any kind of alteration, deviation, miswriting, because he says he is going to protect it. All Qurans, even up to our time, conforming letter for letter, word for word with Uthman Mus'haf. To this day, there is no different version of the Quran. There is but one Quran. There is but one Quran. Not one word, not one letter has changed. Now that's a mouthful. He's no longer saying that. Well, if he is, no one's listening to him. But what we conclude from what they're saying is that they all agree that the Quran we have today has not changed one iota since its inception 1400 years ago. Not one word, not one letter has changed. Exactly the same as that which was on the preserved tablets. Today's Quran parallels in every detail that which was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad and was written down completely by Uthman in 652. So basically what they're saying is there has never been any human intervention. No human interference. This is almost like a magical book that has always existed. It cannot have any human intervention, because if there's any human intervention, then that means there's changes, and that means Allah is not able to guard his word. Can you see then why this is a theological dilemma if they admit to non-preservation? So what's my remit for today? Well, I can't critique uncreated or sent down. There's no way I can do that. I'm not eternal, and I'm certainly not in the 7th century. But I can critique the last 4. I can and I will critique whether or not it was complete at the time of Uthman, whether it has changed since the time of Uthman, whether God has guarded it correctly, or when it was canonized. I'm going to try to hit those 4 in our talk today. So I want to find, and this is what I'll ask to any Muslim, I've said this for years now, I want to find one manuscript of the Quran dated from the mid-7th century, so about 652, which is complete. That means all 114 surahs and unchanged, exactly like the 1924 Hafs Quran used today, and irrevocably guarded by Allah himself, because it has not been changed, or be therefore due to that, it has not been changed. Let's go into the 30 diacritical variants, and let's define what we mean by Qira'at. What are we talking about, or even ahruf? Take a look at those pictures there. You can see those are 2 Qurans, very early Qurans, the Samarkand on the left, the Sana on the right, and there are no dots in there. What you're looking at is the razm. This is the skeletal text. That's the word for it in Arabic. So that is basically just the letters. Just the letters. And there's different opinions as to how many letters existed in the 7th century. Most scholars, I'm told now, go for 16. There were 16 letters. The difficulty is there are many different ways to say those letters. So when you look at just that text on the left, if you're an Arab scholar, you cannot read it. Well, you can try to guess at it. On the right, the same thing. The difficulty is because there are so many different ways of saying just what you're looking at. So something needed to be happened. Something needed to be added. And so this is what they did in the 8th century. Today, we have 28 letters, right? Let's look at the 28 letters. There they are, all 28. That's modern standard Arabic that you're looking at there. But 6 of these letters are unique. They don't need any dots. The Aleph does not need a dot. The Kaf does not need a dot. The Lam does not need a dot. The Mim does not need a dot. The Ha and the Waw. Now, some would also say the Ya, but those are the 6 major ones. Those are the 6 that don't need any dots. The other 22 all need dots, and these dots did not exist on those earlier manuscripts that you saw in the previous slide. They didn't exist in the 7th century. They were only introduced, interestingly, up in Kufa and in Iraq, in the north, in the 8th century, so that people could read they could read what was written on the page. Why is that important? Well, let's just take a look at one letter. Let's just look at this letter. Let's just say a smiley face, because most of the letters in Arabic have this as their root. That could be all kinds of letters. If you put one dot above it, it becomes a na or a nun. Two dots above it, it becomes a ta or a t sound. Three dots above it, it becomes a tha or a th sound. So already, just by putting the dots there, you get three different letters, a smiley face. Now, let's go ahead and look at that smiley face again, unfettered, and let's put one dot below it. It becomes a ba or a b sound. Two dot below it becomes a ya or a y sound. So you can get two more letters. Let's put them all together. Na, ta, tha, ba, ya. Can you see what I'm saying? 5 different letters depending on where you put the dots. 5 different derivations of just one little smiley face. It gets even more pronounced if you want to put, let's say, 3 letters together. If you want to get 3 letters together, 3 smiley faces together, you can get 19 different words. There they are. And Al-Fadi, my colleague, says he can get up to 33. I like to see his graph because I think I need to add that to that, showing that there's all kinds of variations. It could be house, it could be it sprouted, stayed over, a girl, she built, stood firm, grew, we repent, he repents, she repents, he spreads or broadcasts, so does she, or maybe we do it. He fixed or made firm, she destroyed, we destroyed, you destroyed, it was destroyed, or I repented. So all these different words could be there just by adding dots. Notice, I've not said anything about vowels. This is just with the dots. Then they started adding vowels, the dama for the u sound, which goes below the letter. I'm sorry, above the letter, a curlicue above the letter. The fatha, the ah sound, which also goes, it's just a slash that goes above the letter. And then the kasra, the e sound, which goes a slash that goes below the letter. So with 5 dots, you can get at least 19 words with 3 letters. And the 3 letters are important because that's the base of every Arabic word. If you go to an Arabic dictionary, it's always with 3 letters to get the base. I hope you're understanding. I hope you're getting now why I'm zeroing in on this. So before 1924, people were putting material together. And obviously in the 8th century, when they start putting these dots together, they had to come up with lots and lots of variations. Now, I'm going to be quoting from Dr. Shadi Nasser, probably the world authority on the QIRA'AT, on the variants. He came out with a very pivotal book in 2012, and he talks about 5 stages of canonicity, 5 stages where these variants were applied and where the Quran really became canonized. What I mean by that, well, you'll see as we get into these 5 stages. The first stage that he comes up with is what he calls the Uthmanic Codex. This is the first Quran. This was the Quran that was then created for the whole world, and that was done in 652, known as the Qurayshi Codex. 652, roughly 20 years after Muhammad had died. That was the first stage. And at that time, then, there was only one Quran, and that Quran was the Qurayshi Quran. The Qurayshi Quran means it's from the Qurayshi dialect. The Qurayshi dialect was spoken in the Hijaz, in Mecca, Medina, in Central Arabia. Only one dialect, only one Quran, created by Uthman in 652. Then a second stage is what he talked about, referred to as the Ibn Mujahid state, where 7 readings were then chosen. And that now is 300 years later, 936. So suddenly, for the second stage, jumps for 300 years. And that's hugely significant. You'll see why when I put it on a timeline. So that's stage number 2 of canonization of the Quran. The third stage then is introduced by Al-Shatibi. Al-Shatibi is one who actually delineates the 2 transmitters for every one of the 7 readings. And he dies in 1388. So now we're into the 14th century. That's 700 years after Muhammad. So 700 years after Muhammad, then you have 2 transmitters were chosen for every one of the 7 readings that had been chosen by Ibn Mujahid in the 10th century. This was then chosen in the 14th century, but we're still not finished. We have a 4th stage, because then you have Al-Jazari, who then introduces another 3 readings on top of the 7 readings by Ibn Mujahid. Another 3 readings were introduced in around 1429. That's when he died, so just before he died. So in the 15th century, we're talking about 800 years after Muhammad. You then get the 3 added to the 7, which makes 10 readings. So now you have 10 readings, add 2 transmitters for each, and you get up to 30. Are you following my mathematics? 7 plus 3 equals 10. Each one of them has 2 transmitters, so that would be another 20. So 20 plus 10 equals 30. So now by 1429, by the 15th century, you now have 30 different Qur'ans. Well, that's stage number 4. What about stage number 5? Well, stage number 5 then comes with the Hafs, the Quran that we have today. And that is the final canonization. That was chosen in 1924, made official in 1985. So just remember the 5 names. To remember the 5 stages, remember the 5 names. Uthman, Ibn Mujahid, Al-Shatibi, Al-Jazari, and Hafs. If you could just remember those 5 names, you've got the 5 stages. And it's very helpful when you're talking to Muslim to remember these 5, because they don't think about this. They're not aware of this. And it devastates them to realize, hold on a minute, they have no idea of the dates. They think all of this was done at the time of Muhammad. Almost every Muslim I talk to on this, they all assume that these 7 readings were the 7 readings that Muhammad was referring to when he was asked about the different ways of reading it. Oh yeah, I know about this. These are 7 different readings that Jibril introduced to me. That's what they're thinking is going on. This has nothing to do with Muhammad. This has nothing to do with prior to 632. It all begins in 652. Hold on. Let's unpack each of these stages. Let's go through them. But here you are. I'm just going to show you. This is from Wikipedia. You can go and get this. These are the 30 official readers and transmitters. On the left there, look at the green. Those are the 7 readers. Nafi from Medina, Ibn Kathir from Mecca, Abu Amr from Basra, Ibn Amir from Damascus, Asim from Kufa, Hamza from Kufa, Il-Kasai from Kufa. Those are the 7 major readers. Those are chosen by Ibn Mujahid in 936. Now remember, Ibn Mujahid, goodness sakes, why did he choose those 7? We don't know. Yes, we do. Hold on a minute. You're going to get confused. That's why I'm doing this lecture, to completely confuse you, because even Muslims aren't even sure. It gets better and better the more we unpack it. But those are the first 7. Those are the green 7, okay? I put them in green just so you know. Then you have Shatibi, who comes in 1388 and chooses 2 for each one of those 7. So there you see them in the purple on the right. Qalun, Al-Bazi, Al-Duri, Shisham, Shuba, Khalaf, Al-Layth, Warsh, Qunbul, Al-Susi, Ibn Dakwan, Hafs, Khalad, and Al-Duri. All right, do you see them on the right? They were chosen in 1388. That's the 14th century. But then good old Al-Jazari, who is considered to be the father of the Qira'at, he then comes and he wants to add another 3 on top of the 7. So he adds those that are in red. Abu Ja'far from Medina, Yaqub from Basra, and Khalaf from Kufa. That's done in 1429. 1429, that's the 15th century. That's 800 years later. And of course, 2 transmitters are given to him. Isa ibn Wardan, Ruwais, Ishaq, Ibn Jumas, Rao, and Idris. Those are so that then makes the 30. Now, our team in London has gone through just 23 of these, and they've come up with 93,263 differences. Let me repeat that. Just by looking at 23 of these, they've come up with over 93,000 differences between them. Ooh, 93,000 differences, folks. Can you see the dilemma? No wonder when Muhammad Hijab asked this of Yasser Qadhi, which one of these 30 are we going to choose? Is it going to be Qalun? Is it Warsh? Is it going to be Khalad? Will it be Al-Kasai? How about Ruwais? Or it could be any one of these 30. Any one of these 30. And yet this is the one that's chosen. Hafs, the one I've just circled in black. That's the one that was chosen. He was the one, and yet he is not even one of the readers. He is nothing more than a transmitter, and look where he's from. He is from Kufa. Hugely important. We'll be getting into that as to why that's significant. This is Bernie Power, a good friend of mine. He's a professor at Melbourne School of Theology, where I got my doctorate, and this is his collection. These are the 23 Qira'at Qur'ans that he has been able to collect so far. So you can get them today, folks. If he can get them, you can get them. I've already got 8 of them sitting right here. And these are Hattuns 26. And I'm just going to go through them real quickly with you so you can see. These are the 26 Shi that we held up there in 2016. There's Al-Susi. Then you get Ibn Ja'far over here. You get Yaqub there. You get Duri. Over here you get Ibn Amir. Khalaf over here. Then Al-Layth. And then you get Warsh. And hold on, another Warsh. That's true. There's more than one Warsh. Ibn Jamaz. Down here. Duri. Yes, you get 2 Duris. More than just one. And Khalaf over there, and then you get Al-Kasai. Here you get Shoba. And then over there, it's hard to read. It's Ali Imam Abdallah ibn Qatir. Okay, then Hisham over there, Al-Baji. Coming up over here is another Khalaf. Over there is another Shoba. Al-Imam, I'm not even going to try to read that. That's much, much too small. And there's Kalun that comes up and pops up here. Ibn Kathir, one of the 7 major ones. Warsh, he's one of the transmitters. So is Ro. And another Shoba. And then we end with Kalun. So those are the 26 that we held up there at Speaker's Corner in London in 2016, which caused a crisis of faith for Muhammad Hijab and created a crisis of faith for Yasser Qadhi back in 1995 at Yale University. Right. Those are the 37 that she currently has. She just sent me this picture. That's Hatun's 37. So she has gone even above the 30, which begs the question, how could there be 37 if there's only 30 official? Hold on. We're going to answer that one. So she's up to 37. I don't know if anybody who has been able to collect as many as she has. Now, remember, Hatun doesn't read or write a word of Arabic. She is not Arab. She is Turkish. So all the work that she does is not done by her. It is done by her friends there in London who are Arabic speakers, who are all scholars in this area, and they are the ones who are doing the work for her. But she is the face of this. She is the face of this argument. She is the one that instigated this argument. She is the one that pushed it through. She was the one that created the crisis. She is the one that has to be given the credit for everything that we're working with since June 8th. So let's then move on and let's talk about this area of how they were formed. And this is all from Dr. Bernie Power. I had him up and came up to, if you go up on Fander Films, look at the video that he and I did together. This is his PowerPoint. So I've asked permission. He's given me permission to do so. I take no credit for any of this. This is his material that he put together in July of 2020. So this is only about 2 months old. Look at that graph that he has on the right. And this is the problem that Muslims have today. They are told by everybody that Muhammad received 7 ahruf. And there they are. Now, are those the 7 from Umar, Zayd ibn Thabit, Ibn Masud, Uthman, Ubay, Ali, and Abu? No, they're not, because those are the ones that are the caliphs. And they are also the ones that wrote it in different manuscript form. So don't get confused, those 7 with the 7 that supposedly Muhammad received. Muhammad received 7 from Jibril. Jibril gave him 7 different ways of reciting it. Difficulty is, when you talk to Muslims, what are the 7? They point to the ones on the right. Look on the right, the ones circled in green. Ibn Kathir, Ibn Amir, Abu Amr, Is Asim, Nafi, Al-Kisai, Hamza, and I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, those are the 7 right there. So those are the 7 that all the Muslims, whenever you ask them, what are the 7 that Muhammad knew? These are the 7. But they cannot be, as you're going to see later on. I'm going to destroy that one in just about 10 or 15 minutes, because none of those 7 lived or at the time of Muhammad. They all lived years later. In fact, the only one, the first to write down their book, was over 100 years after Muhammad. So be careful when Muslims claim that the 7 readings chosen by Ibn Mujahid are the 7 that Muhammad received. No, they're not. These are 7 ahruf. Ask any Muslim what ahruf means, and every Muslim you ask, you'll get a different definition. Muslims really don't know how to define ahruf. So I'm not going to try to define it. It's from the word harf, which means letter. But what are the ahruf? The 7? Because when you look at those 7 on the right, the majority of them are from Iraq and from Syria. Only 2 of them are from Mecca, Medina, where Muhammad lived. So how could he have known these dialects? If ahruf are dialects, possibly. If these are dialects, how could he have known? He never went to Kufa. He never was in Basra. He never was in Damascus. He was always in Mecca, Medina, in that area. So there is a difficulty in and of itself, to say nothing of the fact that, as we're going to see, Uthman destroyed all of those. Now, here is a chain of transmission that Muslims tell us for Hafs. So Hafs comes from Asim. That's the family he comes from. That's the reader who died in 774. But look at generation 0, 1, and 2. Those generations 0, 1, and 2, we don't have anything. It's all nothing more than attribution. These are what people say are the transmission. We don't have any references outside of the later traditions for the generation 1 or generation 2, to say nothing of Muhammad himself. We don't have anything in our hands from Ubay bin Ka'b or Uthman or Zayd ibn Thabit or Ali. Nothing. Nothing. Abu Abdul Rahman al-Salami, we don't have his material. We're only find traditions that attribute these people. No manuscripts, nothing more than attribution. Awesome, we do have. Awesome, we do have. I have him right here. He's on my table. Let me see if I can. Here he is right here. Even Awesome. No, I don't. Sorry. I'm wrong. I don't have Awesome yet. Not yet. I have Shoba, but I don't have Awesome. That's Hafs. What about Warsh? Well, Warsh has 5 generations in between, but generation 0, 1, 2, 3, we don't have anything for. We don't have anything from Uba Huraira or Ibn Abbas or Abdullah ibn Ayash, Abu Jafar, Abu Dawud, Nasa, or Abdul Muslim, Abu Ru. These don't have, they're just attributions. These are nothing more than redactions onto these people. Did they even exist? Who knows? We don't even know if Abu Bakr, Umar, or Uthman, or Ali existed. We can't find any reference to any of these 4 caliphs in the 7th century at all. So you can see we're all talking about speculation, attribution, redactions. We do have Nafi, 785. We do have Nafi. And we also have Warsh. I have Warsh right here on my table. And Qalun. So let's go and take a look on a timeline, what we're talking about. You need to put it on a timeline to understand. So Muhammad dies in 632. All right. So we begin with one Quran that was revealed to him. Just one Quran. Why? Because there's only one Quran in heaven. So that was revealed to him between 610 and 632 had to be one Quran, right? However, we're told that Jibril gives him 7 readings. This is what we're told in the traditions. 7 readings. Well, so now there are 7 Qurans. At least 7 Qurans at the time that Muhammad died in 632. Am I correct? All right. Then comes Uthman. And he decides to only have one Quran again. So he writes, has Zayd ibn Thabit with Hisham, Zubair, and Al-As. Who are these Hisham, Zubair, and Al-As? Well, we find out now that they are the son-in-laws of Uthman, which means they had no scholarly position. They had no knowledge behind them. All they had was they were in the right pedigree. They came from the family of Uthman. So Uthman gives his son-in-laws to help Zayd ibn Thabit create the Qurayshi Quran. The Qurayshi Quran is the Qurayshi dialect. The Qurayshi dialect is the dialect that is spoken there in Mecca and Medina in Central Arabia. And that is the dialect that Muhammad would have spoken. And I assume that's the dialect that's in heaven. That's the one that exists in heaven. But how do you find the Qurayshi dialect? Well, you find it by looking at dots and vowels. That's how you know how it's written down. There were no dots and vowels in the 7th century, you ask. And that is true. So how can you have a Qurayshi dialect that's distinct from other dialects in a written form since there were no dots and vowels to show the differences? Can you see how the questions just start to flow out as we're bringing it up? And this is why you need to ask your Muslim friends, can you make sense of all this? This just doesn't make sense. Nonetheless, what the traditions tell us is that Uthman made this one Qurayshi Quran and that he then destroyed all the others. Burned them. It says that in Al-Bukhari, volume 6. Hadith number 510. He destroys and burns all the other dialects, all the other Qurans. What dialects are we talking about? Well, according to what we know there in Al-Bukhari 6, what we do know is that there was a battle up in Azerbaijan in 652. Hudayfa, who was in charge of the Meccans and Medinans, they were fighting along other Muslims that came from Iraq and Syria. So as they were fighting, in the middle of their fight, they go to a mosque and they pray. As they are praying and reciting the Quran, Hudayfa hears the Quran recited differently than what he remembers, and he gets angry, and they come to blows. They actually start punching each other up. So Hudayfa then zittles back down to Medina, and he talks to Uthman. He says, we've got to do something. We must not let the Quran have many different Qurans like the Jews and the Christians have. We must have just one Quran. We cannot have these different Qurans. So Uthman agrees, and that's why he commissions Zayd ibn Thabit, along with Zubair, Alas, and Hisham, his 3 son-in-laws, to rewrite the Quran in this Qurayshi dialect, into one Qurayshi dialect. So that happens in 652. And then he takes all those other Qurans that existed, burned them. 652, they're all burned. So those are all the Qurans from Kufa. Those are all the Qurans from Basra. Those are all the Qurans from Damascus. So all the Qurans from Iraq and Syria were destroyed in 652. Only one was retained, and that is the Uthmanic Qurayshi Quran, right? 5 copies then were sent to 5 different cities of the Qurayshi Quran. They were sent to Yathrib, which then later became Medina. That's Medina today. One was sent to Mecca. And with every one of these copies, there was a reader. A reader was sent with them who understood it and read it in the Qurayshi dialect to make sure that they retained that Qurayshi dialect. But they didn't just send it to those two cities. They also sent one to Basra, which had a different dialect, one to Kufa, which had a different dialect, and one to Damascus, which had a different dialect. That's why they're in black. 5 copies sent to 5 cities. But those copies were Qurayshi, so they had to take every one of those and destroy the other dialects and interpose their Qurayshi dialects. So now you have 5 cities in 5 different locations, all now with the Qurayshi dialect. So from 7, it goes back to 1 Quran, all right? From 7 Qurans that had the time of, well, of Muhammad, back to 1 with Uthman, and this is known as the Qurayshi Quran. So by that time, in the end of the 7th century, there is only 1 Quran, and it is only in the Qurayshi dialect. It is not in the Kufan or the Basran or the Damascus dialect. Are you following this? Hugely important. However, hold on a minute. We're also told that there were other manuscripts that appear. Ubay ibn Ka'b's manuscript. His manuscript becomes very popular in Damascus. And he has a completely different derivation. Hold on. Oh, wait a minute. I thought there was only 1 Uthmanic Quran. What is this other manuscript coming from? And it's not the same length as the Uthmanic manuscript, because the Uthmanic manuscript done by Zayd ibn Thabit has 114 books or chapters or surahs. This one has 116 books or chapters or surahs. And then another one appears, a much more important one, in fact, a much more famous one by Ibn Masud. And it only has 111. Some say 112. Others say 110, but not 114. And that appears in Kufa and in Baghdad. And Kufa was a center of learning at this time, as we're going to find out in 2 weeks. Hold on to Kufa, hold on to Baghdad, hold on to Iraq, because everything comes out of Iraq. And this is what's happening in the 7th century. So Ibn Masud and Ubay ibn Ka'b, they are companions of Muhammad, so they know Muhammad intimately. They're much older than Zayd ibn Thabit. Ibn Masud brags about the fact that when he heard the Quran be recited, Zayd ibn Thabit was just a little lad who was playing with toys. And then a third one is introduced here in Basra, in southern Iraq. It has 114 surahs, which is very much like Zayd ibn Thabit's. Zayd ibn Thabit's, hold on a minute, he is Qurayshi. So here you have 3 other manuscripts that are up in the north that are not the same as the one that's there in Medina and Mecca. So put this under your hat. Can you see this is not to do with, this has nothing to do with Qira'at. These are actual manuscripts. This is what we're going to get into in the next week, the consonantal. These are ones that are different. What is interesting is Ibn Masud's becomes so famous that he is the one that they still retain. And what you're going to find is that almost all those Qurans, the Qira'at Qurans, which are from Kufa, are all following his manuscript, his derivation, his Quran. Hugely important, because that is where the Quran we use today comes from. Not from Mecca, not from Medina, but much further north. Now, let's take a look and let's see what we're talking about on a timeline. So here Muhammad dies in 632. Uthman's Qurayshi Quran is then created in 652. Then you start getting these qira'ats, and the first you get is this guy Ibn Amir. I've got Ibn Amir's right here. This is Ibn Amir. I'm going to hold it up, see if you can see it. This is the Ibn Amir. This is the very first Quran. This is the Quran that now existed at the time of 732. Can you see the Arabic there? I don't know if you can see this. I know it's, we have most of the screen is PowerPoint, but there you can see it right there. That's the Ibn Amir Quran. It's all in Arabic. You notice it all has dots and vowels. That's where the dots and the vowels now were being introduced in the 8th century. And the earliest, the very first one is this one right here, Ibn Amir. But look at the date. Look at the date. He died in 736. That's 100 years after Muhammad. And he did not live in Mecca, Medina. He lived in Damascus, 1,200 miles further north. So he was nowhere from Mecca, Medina. He did not live at the time of Muhammad. This cannot be one of the 7 readings that Jibril gave to Muhammad way back before 632. It's over 100 years later. And that's the very first one. That's the very first one. After his, then we now have this one here. Ibn Kathir. Ibn Kathir. He dies in 738. So now we have still over 100 years later. Then after that comes Asim, who is very important because he's the family from which Hafs comes from. And then you have Abu Amr, he dies in 770. And then you have Hamza, who dies in 772. Nafi from Medina, he dies in 785. And then we have Al-Qasai from Kufa, 737 to 805. So he dies in the 9th century. Are you following this? I'm giving you this on a timeline. I'm putting them all there or on the timeline. That's why I put them in the order of when they appear. And they start from 736 all the way up to 805. So from the 8th century, mid-8th century, all the way up to the beginning of the 9th century, 100 to 150 years after Muhammad. They are chosen by this man here, Ibn Mujahid, in the 10th century, 936, 10th century, 300 years after Muhammad. Then we have another 3 that are chosen. Abu Jafar, Medina, he dies in 748. Yaqub, he dies in 821. And Khalaf, he dies in 844. Who chose them? Well, this guy chooses them. Al-Jazari, 1429. So now we have the 10 official Qurans. These are known as the creme de la creme. These are known as the best of the best. These are known as the 10 holy Qurans. This is what Dr. Jasad Qadhi always talks about. And when you talk to a Muslim on the street, when you talk to a Muslim who's your friend, when you talk about the readings, these are the 10 readings. All the Muslims refer to these 10 readings. Nafi, Ibn Kathir, Abu Amr, Ibn Amir, Asim, Hamza, Al-Qasai, Abu Jafar, Yaqub, and Khalaf. Those are them, the 10. I just want to put Abdul Malik there because you notice they all come after Abdul Malik. You'll see why. I have an agenda. This will become really apparent in 2 weeks. Abdul Malik is the one that introduces Islam. All of these come after Abdul Malik. Not one of them comes before 692. Not one of them comes before his reign. That's why I want to put it up there, just remind you. But hold on a minute. Something's missing. Something's missing. Where's Hafs and Warsh? Where are the 2 most important? Where are the ones that have been canonized in 1924 that were then made official in 1985? Where is the one that is used all over the world today and which 90% of the world's now population now use? Where is the one that is used all over North Africa, the Watch? Where are those 2? They're not in this list. They're not part of the creme de la creme. They're not part of the best of the best. They do not exist at all in the 10 qira'at, the 10 readers, sorry, the 10 readers. So where do they come from? Well, they are introduced by this guy here, Al-Shatibi, in 1388. Al-Shatibi is known basically for writing a poem. He wrote a poem, Al-Shatibi. And he wrote this poem in around the 1300s. I don't know the exact date. No one's really been able to give me the exact date. But anyways, he wrote before he died. And he died in 1388. So it had been the 1300s. So we're talking about 700 years, but roughly 700 years after, 700 years after Muhammad died. In this poem, there were many different derivations. There are many different transmitters, many different students that came from every one of these 10 readers. So he wrote in this poem just 2. He's the one that actually chose the 2 for each reader. So he chose 2 for Nafi in Medina. He chose these Al-Bazi and Kumbul for Ibn Kathir. He chose these 2 Al-Duri and Al-Susi for Abu Amr. He chose Hisham and Al-Dakwan for Ibn Amir, and Shuba and Hafs for Asim, Khalaf and Khalad for Hamza. He chose Alayt and Al-Duri for Qasai. So now you have 21 official Qurans. He comes in and makes it 21. From 10, it now goes up to 21. Al-Jaziri then also chooses 2 for each, and so he chooses Ism Wardan for Abu Jafar and Ibn Jumaz for him as well. Then he also chose Ruwais and Rao, and also Ishaq and Idris. So now you get to 30 Qurans. So by 1429, by the 15th century, 800 years after Muhammad, you finally have the 30. 2 for each one of the readers. There are 10 readers. 2 for each one of them, that's 20. Here you get your 30. Are you following that? Okay, that's how it all comes back. But look at the dates. Look at the dates. I can't even get them on the timeline. They're so far out. 1388, you have to have an arrow pointing to where they are. Al-Jazari, that's another 14. That's the 15th century. That's 800 years after Muhammad. Hafs and Warsh then are chosen at that period in the 14th and 15th century. 14th and 15th century, that, folks, is 700 years and 800 years after Muhammad. You finally get the 2 most important. Now, Now, I just want to show you, this is a graph that Hutton made a number of years ago. It's a little bit out of date, but I want you to look at those little brown clouds on the right. Every one of those are the different readers and the different narrators or the different transmitters, as we call them. And the little numbers in black are the differences they have with Hafs, who is circled here. Hafs is the one that we use today. Hafs is the canonical text that we use all over the world today. And every time you see a little brown cloud there with a number in it, you can see that they are. Let's look at Abu Ali al-Harith. He died in 864, and he has 5,000 differences, 5,000 words that are different, 5,000 letters that are different, which means 5,000 variants from Hafs, who was chosen. He died in 796, and he was chosen in 1924. So let's go back. Where is the source for everything I'm saying? Where does it all come from? What does everything I'm saying in this lecture, where does it all come from? Let's go to that source. Well, let's bring up Muhammad again. Let's bring up Uthman's Qureshi dialect, 652. And those are now we're looking at the 30 official Qurans that were chosen by Ibn Mujahid for the first 7. Al-Shatibi were chosen for the next 14. And then Al-Jazari, who chose the next 3 plus 6. So that means 30. So those are the 30 that we just looked at, all right? Put them up a little bit smaller so we can get them all into this graph. Where do we know all about this? What is the source for everything I've just said, everything that I've said up to this time? What does it all come from? Well, it first is written down by this guy here, Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Ishaq, he dies in 765. He's the first one to write this all down about who Muhammad was and what he did. But we don't have Ibn Ishaq. It's this guy here, Ibn Hisham, that we have that actually tells us what Ibn Ishaq said, but throws out much of it. He doesn't trust Ibn Ishaq, so let's get rid of Ibn Ishaq. So really, the first time we have anything written down by any of this material above, anything we know about Muhammad, everything we know about what was said, and also how these Qurans were written and put together, that first is written down by al-Waqidi, but is this guy here, al-Bukhari, who actually tells us when the Quran was put together. As far as the Quran is concerned, he is the first one to write the hadith, and that's where you get these references to these original 7, and then the 10, and then of course the other references that we have after that. Now, he doesn't at all, Bukhari doesn't know anything about the 2 for each one, because look at his dates. He comes long before any of these guys even come up with the 2. So all he's writing about is how the Quran is put together. After him comes Sahih Muslim. After him comes Ibn Dawud, Tirmidhi, and then finally you get Al-Tabari. So these are known as the Islamic traditions. I've not put all their names there because I'm just running out of space. But you get the idea. They all come after Ibn Hisham. They all come after 833. Everything we know about the Quran, everything we know about Muhammad, everything we know about what he did, where he said, who he lived with, his wives, everything comes from these guys. But take a look at their dates. They are not living at the time of Muhammad. They're not even living at the time of Abdul Malik. In fact, what's interesting, they don't even begin to appear for 140 years after Abdul Malik. 44 years is when the first QIRA'ATS are introduced, and that's 44 years after Abdul Malik. But if you take Abdul Malik away, because Abdul Malik is the one that introduces Islam as we know it today, but take him away, and you look at Muhammad, this is over 200 years after Muhammad that this is finally introduced. Not for 200 years do we get his first biography written down. Not for 240 years do we get his first sayings written down. Not for 300 years do we get the first tafsir, the commentaries, and the histories written down by Al-Tabari and others that come after him. And not for 700 years do we get not for 300 years do we also get the first reference to the first 7 of these writings. That's Ibn Mujahid. And another 700 years after Muhammad do we get Al-Shatibi, who then chooses the 2 transmitters for each one of the 7. And it's not till Al-Jazari in 1429 that we get finally all 30 of these Qurans put down. So we're talking about 2 to 3 to 5 to 7 to 800 years after Muhammad, all this gets put together. Are you seeing that on the timeline? That's why I put it there. Just so you see, this is all later. It is all redacted, and that's why there are so many errors. Now, can you then see why it's important that you need to show this to your Muslim friends? But hold on a minute. Were there more than 30 QIRA'ATS? Now we're going to look between the years 736 and 936, the time the first that Ibn Amir writes his Quran. That's the Ibn Amir rendition, and the Ibn Mujahid, who chooses the first 7. Let's look at just that time period. And this is coming from Shadi Nasr. Now let's go back to Qiraat. Let's look at this timeline again. Let's review. Remember the 10 readings. There are the 10 readings. And then we have the 20 narrators, or the 20 transmitters. There they are. So remember those. Just get those in your head. There were many more than those. We've just said 30 official ones, and that's all the one that Muhammad Hijab was asking about, just the 30. There is many more than 30. What are we talking about? Well, let's go on and see. Because when we look at Shadi Nasr's material, what he wrote in 2012, he refers to many more that came up long after, or that came up between these, in these intervening 200 years. Now, I want to show you, take a look at these here. Are you all seeing this? Can you all see this? These are my QIRA'ATS. So these are the ones that I have bought. So here you have Ibn Amir. He's the first, 736. And then you have Ibn Kathir. He's 738. And he is the one from Mecca. Al-Qasai, he is 805. So he's the oldest. And Khalaf, he's 844. So he's even older. So you have those 4 are what we know is from the 7 readers. And then you have Al-Duri and Shoba. Those are transmitters along with Warsh and Kalim. So 4 and 4, those are transmitters. And then, of course, the Hafs, which is also transmitter. So I have 5 transmitters and 4 of the official 10 readers. And I just bought these back in August. So you can buy them as well. You can get them. And I know, Korede, you have 10. You're one ahead of me. Then on top of that, I have this. And you can get this. This is from Bridges. And these are the translation of the 10 Qira'at of the Noble Quran. So these are all the first 10, not the entire ones. These are just bits and pieces from them, but it gives you a comparison so you can actually compare them. And it's all in English. You can buy this, and he goes through all of all the derivations and what they're coming up with and how the history. Now, beware of the fact that everything that he writes in there is from the Islamic traditions. So he's not at all interested in this newest historical study that Shadi Nasr is doing. In fact, Shadi Nasr is about to destroy the entire, I call it the Abbasid narrative. This is all the narrative about how the Quran is put together from the Abbasid period. It only gets introduced after 749 when they come to power. And that's why Ibn Ishaq in 765 writes his first biography of Muhammad. Isn't that odd that you have to wait till 765 to get a biography of a guy who died in 632? But his then is introduced, was eradicated and introduced a new one by Ibn Hisham in 833. So this book only speaks from that perspective. It speaks from the Islamic traditions perspective, from Ibn Hisham, Al-Waqidi, Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, and on. He does not at all take into, doesn't even want to discuss the historicity, or even the dates, or even the fact that this is all so late. Anyhow, that's why Shadi Nasr has been such a blessing. Let's get back to sharing our screen. Let's get right back into where we were, and let's continue on with this next section, which is looking at what Shadi Nasr is coming up with, because he, back in 2012, in his book, The Transmission of the Variant Readings of the Quran, he refers to the fact that between the 8th century, when you have Ibn Amir, who's the guy I have right here, there's Ibn Amir, when he wrote his Quran in 736, and the 10th century, when you have Ibn Mujahid, who then chooses the 7, here's 4 of the 7, when he chooses them before he dies in 936. That intervening 200 years, there was an awful lot going on. There were many other transmitters. There were many other students known as rawis, or they're narrators. These are students. These are the ones that come underneath each one of the 7 readers. Each one of the 7 readers, it wasn't just 2. There were many more than 2. Many more than 2. And see, we're not told this. I didn't know this before June 8th. I've all learned all this stuff now that I'm going into Shadi Nasr. Now that I'm going into it, because it's all over the internet, because everybody's talking about it. I wanted to find out really what history is telling us. And what history is telling us is there were many, many more than just the 2 that come up between for all the 7. In fact, so many that it became a crisis. And that's why it forced al-Shatibi, who in the 1300s to create a poem, and he wrote a poem, and in that poem he then referred to the two transmitters for each of the seven, and he's only talking about the seven because the other three hadn't been chosen yet. They were not chosen for another 100 years later in the 1400s or the 15th century. So he's just talking about two for every of the seven. Here are four of the seven, and then he's talking about those two and those two. All right, and again, what we're talking is 14 of them. So that was only chosen in the before 1388, around the 1300s, so the 14th century. So let's go ahead and do a review. Remember the review? Before the break, we looked at this. That's the review we want to look at. And can you see, there are the 7 green that were chosen by Ibn Mujahid. Then you have the 3 red that were chosen by Al-Jazari, in 1429. And then you have the other 20 purple ones. Those are 2 transmitters or narrators or students, just call them students, for each one of the 10. Nasser notes that there were other scholars besides Al-Shatibi who chose the Rawis from the initial 7 readers. Al-Shatibi wrote his poem in the 1300s, but back in the 1000s or the 11th century, you have a man named Al-Dani. He had a completely different list, and this was the problem. He had a different list than what Al-Shatibi was going to come up later. So for Nafi, he had 4 Rawis. For Ibn Kathir, he had 3 Rawis. For Abu Umar, he had 2 Rawis or transmitters. For Ibn Amir, 5 Rawis. Asim, 4 Rawis. Hamza, 1 Rawi. Al-Kasai, 5 Rawis. A total of 24 Rawis. That means narrators or transmitters. That's 10 more than Al-Shatibi came up with in the 1300s, all right? So this is not the only list. Al-Dani had this list, 24 different Rawis that he chose from the others that existed. No, that's not the only one. There's another scholar. His name is Abu Ali al-Maliki. He died in 1046, again, the 11th century. He also had a separate list from that which was finally chosen by Rawi. Nafi, he had 4 Rawis. For Ibn Kathir, 2 Rawis. For Abu Amr, 3 Rawis. Ibn Amir, 2 Rawis. Asim, 2 Rawis. Hamza, 4 Rawis. And Al-Kasai, 8 Rawis. That's a total of 25, let's get that correct. That's a total of 25 Rawis or narrators or transmitters. 11 more than Al-Shatibi. 11 more. So this is not standardizing. You can see why this causes a problem. There were so many different transmitters. There were so many different students that they had a real crisis on their hand. There were so many different ways of saying or reading the Quran. All of them different. They weren't even on all these students. Now, I always thought that students always did what their master told them or what their teacher told them, but evidently they wrote completely different Qurans than their masters and their teachers, and that's why you had a dilemma on your hand. As we've said, just from 23 that were chosen, the team in London have already come up with 93,000 differences. Well, you can imagine the crisis that this created in the 11th and 12th century. So as a result of that, they needed to create and they needed to choose which were the authentic, the canonical Rawis, the authentical, or what we know as the transmitters or the students. How did they choose them? Well, they usually chose by who had the largest number of students after them. In other words, who was the most popular. Now, that's not how you use textual criticism. That's not how we've done it with the Bible. When you come across all these manuscripts that we've now been able to discover all over the world, especially since the 1800s, like the Sinaiticus and the Alexandrinus, and the Vaticanus, and all these different, the John Bodmer Papyrus and all the rest. These manuscripts and these fragments, how do you choose which are authentic? How do you know whether they are authentic or not? You look and you go to the earliest manuscript, which would be the Greek manuscripts, and you see whether or not they agree with the earliest manuscript. You look at the words, you look at the letters, you look at the sentences, and you look and see which are the closest, not by who is the most popular or who has the most students or who lives in such a city. It's what the words say. This has not been done with the Quran. The biblical text critical analysis, really textual criticism, was created on the Bible. We always look text with text, word with word, letter with letter, to delineate which is the closest or the most authentic, which is the one that's exactly like the former. That's called textual criticism. Evidently, this was not done. These were not done by choosing these Rawis. They were only concerned with who was the most popular, in other words, who had the most students that came after them. And whether there were any single lines. If there was only one line that came after them, if only one student came after them, they threw them out. How do they know if any of the Rawis between the 8th and 10th century had anything comparable to the readers they are associated? The fact that they have different readings means that none of them followed their teachers. And there was nothing at all corresponding between the Rawis that came after and the teachers that came before, or the readers that came before. But hold on a minute, they weren't always the most popular. Let's look at Warsh. Warsh, who is from Medina, right? We've been told he's from Medina, right? No, he wasn't. He was not from Medina. Even though he is in the line of Nafi, who is from Medina, who died in 786. Warsh, who died in 812, is not from Medina. What's fascinating, when you look at the graph of all these readers that come after and before him, he had very few that came after him. In fact, there were others like Ismail ibn al-Jafar and also al-Musayyabi, who were also part of the family of Nafi from Medina, who were from Medina, and they had many more students. They were much more authoritative using the criteria of popularity. They would be much more authoritative than Warsh. So why was Warsh chosen, since he had so few readers, so few transmitters, so few students that come after him? According to Nasser, it was because he lived in Egypt. While Ismail ibn Jafar and Musayyabi remained in Medina, Qalun was also already in Medina, so they didn't need another one from there. Furthermore, Al-Dani also lived and studied in Egypt, and that's why he was chosen, because Al-Dani wanted him, because Warsh was then chosen for where he lived. Had nothing to do with his ability, had nothing to do with his text, had nothing to do with textual criticism, had nothing to do with the similarity between his text and that of Nafi. It had everything to do with where he lived. It had everything to do with his location. That's it, folks. So how many of these intermediary Rawis were there? Were there more than 20 or more than 30? Let's see what Nasser shows us. So these are all from Nasser's study from 2012. Let's look at Ibn Kathir from Mecca, dies in 738. Between Ibn Kathir up there and Ibn Mujahid down here. So he was one that chose Ibn Kathir, right? Take a look at all those names you see in between. Now, we know that good old Al-Shatibi, he chose Al-Basi, who died in 864, and he chose Kunbul to be the two transmitters from Ibn Kathir. But there's an awful lot of other names there. Many, many other names. How many? 59 different Qira'at, 59 different Rawis, 59 different transmitters that he could have chosen with. All of them had different Qurans, all written down. None of them were the same as Ibn Kathir, and yet Mujahid chose Ibn Kathir, and Shatibi is the one that chose just those two out of the other 59, and he threw out the other 57. Let's look at Nafi from Medina itself. Between Nafi up here and Ibn Mujahid down here, 936, you're talking about roughly, 150 to 200 years. You have Qalun, who was chosen in Warsh. We know why Warsh was chosen, not because he has lots of threads after him, very few, but there's others. If you look at Ismail and Jafar over to the left, and Musayyabi, or just a little above him, I should have circled them, sorry, but you can see them up on the upper left there. They have many more threads, much more authoritative. They are from Medina. Warsh is not from Medina. He is from Egypt. He is from Cairo. So, Shatibi had 63 to choose from. There were 63 that he could have chosen. He just chose those two. Let's look at Abu Amr from Basra, 750. There he is right there, and here's Ibn Mujahid here. So that intervening 200 years, Al-Shatibi told Al-Duri, and he chose Al-Susi. How many could he have chosen from? 65 that he could have chosen from. All of them written down, none of them agreeing with Abu Amr, and yet he chose those two out of 65, threw the other 63 away. And finally, we're going to do this last one. Here you have Asim. This is the one who lived in Kufa. 745 was his date. Mujahid down here, 936. There's the 200 intervening years. Now, Shatibi chose Shuba and he chose Hafs. Shatuba and he chose Hafs in the 1300s. He could have chosen 91 different Qira'at, 91 different Rawis, 91 different Qurans. He chose those two. All of those other 91 are written down. The other 89 he threw away and just retained those two. So, a conclusion with this area, Qiraats between Ibn Kathir in Mecca and Ibn Majid, 59. Qiraats between Nafi, Medina and Ibn Mujahid, 63. Qiraats between Abu Amr and Ibn Mujahid, 65. And qiraats between Asim and Mujahid, 91. That's a total of 278 different qiraats just with those four. But remember, we have, that means an average of 70, but we have 10 qiraats, not just four. We have 10 qiraats. If they average 70 with just those four, that could be a possibility of 700. Up to 700 different Qurans, folks. We're not talking about 10. We're not talking about 7. We're not talking about 3. We're not talking about 20. We're not talking about 30. We could have as many as 700 different Qurans. Why haven't Muslims told us this? Why have that we have to do the study and actually go and unpack it for ourselves, folks? Can you then understand why this is such a dilemma for Muslims today? Hugely significant. Now, let's look at some of these qira'at differences. Here's just two, and these are slides that I put together with Hatun way back in 2016. I decided to put some of these together, and we took them down to Speaker's Corner. So listen, there's over 70 of these. We don't have time to look at all of them. I've just taken a smattering of maybe 10 or 11 just to show you. So on the left, you have Hafs, and on the right, you have Warsh. Left is in green. Yakzibuna is the word there. In their hearts is a disease, and Allah increases their disease of painful doom is theirs because they lie. So that's what it says in the Hafs. In the Warsh, it's been changed to they accuse others of lying. So hold on a minute. Are they doomed because they lie or because they accuse others of lying? The person doing the action is contradictory. So there you can see a contradiction in action between these two. Is this significant? I let you decide whether that's significant or not. Here's another one, chapter 2, verse 184. And there is miskeenan versus masakina. And if you look there carefully, you will see it's just a difference in different vowelizations. These are difference in vowelization and also the dagar aleph in the masakina, in the Warsh. So the translation is one poor person. And for those who can fast with difficulty, they have to feed a poor person, or they may affect redemption by feeding poor men. So more than one. So if you're fasting and you want to know how many you're supposed to feed, it all depends if you read Hafs or Warsh. If you read Hafs, you only have to feed one. If you read Warsh, you have to feed many poor men. It makes a big difference. And that's theological difficulties, because this is what gets you into heaven. This is what gives you the barakah that's recorded on the right shoulder by the angel that's there. So this is hugely important for those who want to know whether or not they have to do one or another. Chapter 3, verse 79. Alimun, you teach, versus in Warsh, ta'lamun. So in Hafs, it says you are teaching the book and you are studying it. Biyu rabbaniyun, the Warsh says, because you know the book. So do believers teach the book, or do they simply know the book? Many people can know a book, but are not capable of teaching it. So there's a difference in category. Chapter 3, verse 146. Qatala versus qutla. So here you're talking about the prophets. They either fought or they were killed. Now, if I were a prophet, I would like to simply fight, thank you. I prefer the Hafs than the Warsh, because in the Warsh, I'm being killed. And the difference here has to do with, take a look, a fatha is changed to a dama, and you have a fatha is and for the ta is changed to a kasra, and then also a fatha is then kasra, a dama is changed to a fatha. So you have, instead of katala, you now have kutila, either fought or killed. Hugely important, depending on whether a prophet just fights or he dies. Chapter 7, verse 57. In the Hafs, it's al-riya bushra, whereas in the Alayt ibn Khalid, it's al-ri nasra. So one says the wind bears good news, the other said the wind scatters. Now, does the wind bear good news, or does it scatter rain clouds? It seems the wind has two completely different functions here. Nothing really theologically significant, but that would be a contradiction. And can you see then when Muslims say there are no differences, these are exactly the same meaning. Shabir Ali says this all the time. There's nothing of belief, there's nothing of practice, there's no difference between these words. They mean all the same thing. Take a look, we're finding all kinds of differences. And I'm just giving you a quick smattering. Here you have chapter 19, verse 77. And the Hafs, it's waladan, and the Khalaf, it's wuldan. One is a child, the other is children. So are the disbelievers given one child or many children? I would want to know how many children I get to disbelieve. That's hugely significant from a theological standpoint. Here's chapter 38, verse 45. Ibadana, dagar aleph is added there with slaves. Al-Bazi has his abdana, no dagar aleph, slave. So, and remember our slaves, remember, there it's plural, Ibrahim, Isaac, and Yaqub. So Hafs is correct. But Al-Bazi says, and remember our slave, Ibrahim, Isaac, and Jacob. So here you can see there's a grammatical problem. Is it 3 listed slaves or just 1? It looks like there's 3 listed. So it looks like Hafs has it correct. Al-Bazi has a grammatical difference. He doesn't even know how to count. In chapter 43, verse 19, you have Ibadu versus Inda. And they make the angels who are slaves of the beneficent females. On the other hand, Rao says, and they make the angels who are in the presence of the beneficent females. So is it slaves or in the presence? 2 problems. Are the angels slaves of Allah or simply in the presence of Allah? Another problem, is it the slaves or those in Allah's presence who then become females? If I were an angel, I would prefer to be in God's presence and not his slave. However, if I were an angel and a male, since I am, I prefer if only slaves are made females, thank you, not me. Okay, so you can see there's all kinds of things you can run with on this one. Chapter 46, verse 15, it's Ihsanan versus Husnan in Al-Duri's translation. And we are not translation, their variant. And we have enjoined on man doing good to his parents, whereas Al-Duri says, and we have enjoined on man beauty to his parents. Are men supposed to do good or be beautiful to their parents? Now, I'm a parent. I have 3 sons. I would prefer if my sons do good rather than just be good looking. Now, so you can see that would make a difference. Chapter 49, verse 5, Fataba Yunu versus Fatatha. So you have a different letter here depending on where you put the dots. So here the dots do make a difference, because one on the left in Hafs it says verify it, whereas on the right it says just stand firm for those who believe. If a rebellious person comes to you with news, either stand firm or verify it. Now, do we verify a bad person's news or do we stand firm? Verifying news is more practical than just standing still and doing nothing. And then let's end with this one. This is chapter 98, verse 6. This is the one that Shabir Ali had the worst problem with, because this is a theological difference. Hafs has al-barayati, and Warsh has al-barayati. One is creatures, and the other is the innocent. Indeed, they who disbelieved among the people of the scripture and the polytheists will be in the fire of hell, abiding eternally therein. Those are the worst of creatures. That's what it says in Hafs. On the right, it says, those are the worst of the innocent. Are we Christians, because it's talking about us, those are the people of the scripture, are we the worst creatures or are we innocent? And what are we, and what are innocent Christians, Jews and polytheists doing in hell if we are innocent, according to Warsh? So here's a difference between Hafs and Warsh that's hugely significant and has also theological implications. Now, it was great to have Al-Fadi to go through each one of these when we did a live stream on Fander Film. And he is a native Arab speaker. Shabir Ali isn't. He understands grammar. He's doing his doctorate in this area. He's actually looking at verses just like this, and he's finding theological problem after theological problem. And so it was great for him to say from the Arabic, this is hugely significant. You have an enormous difference here, theologically speaking, to say nothing of the fact that it changes the word and it changes the letter. Bernie Powers then once did a brilliant job, and I thought it was so helpful to have him come on board to look and just compare the Hafs and the Warsh. I have both the Hafs and the Warsh here. Here is the Warsh. This is known all over North Africa, and that's in my right hand. In my left hand, I have the Hafs. These are the 2 most popular Qurans in the world today. Hafs is used by about 90% of the world's population. The Warsh is used about 7% of the world's population, but used all over North Africa. So just looking at these 2 books, you can get 5,000 differences, 5,000 differences. And so what he does, he looks at a comparison of both the Hafs and Warsh, and he wants to see how many differences. Well, he said there's one Islamic website that identifies just 51 variations. He has found 120 consonantal and long vowel symbols differences, which affect the meaning of the words, and another 5,000 short vowel or diacritical mark differences. So this is not 51 variations like the Muslims are admitting. Bernie Power and his team, they're in Australia, have come up with 5,000 differences. Some of the letters or symbols are missing from the Hafs version, but included in the Warsh. Some letters or symbols found in the Hafs version are missing from the Warsh, so it's back and forth. Sometimes they have same number of letters and symbols in the corresponding, but they are different letters or symbols. Their meanings are different, therefore. He had different types. Type A, he looked at 11 instances where there are changes in the meaning of the nouns. And I'm not going to spend time because this will take too long. You can look at this on your own because this PowerPoint will be coming to you in a PDF form. So there you can see a change in the meaning of the nouns, 11 instances. Here you have in type B, change of nouns from singular to plural. A poor person becomes poor people. depending on the context, that has a huge ramifications. A type C, a third type, was changing from a noun to a preposition, from slaves to with, or he made to maker. Hugely different, looking at the context of what that does to the verse. Another fourth type, D, changing meaning to a different verb. So you have they lied versus they disbelieved, or he fought versus he was killed, that I mentioned earlier in the examples I gave. Another type, fifth one, change a verb from active to passive. 7 instances that he found there. For example, like from chapter 9, verse 37, are led astray to he leads astray, or they are killed, they fight, much like what we saw earlier with the prophets. Type F, changing a verb from second person singular to third person singular. So from he saved us to you save us, or he is versus you are. He deviates, you deviate. Again, the person is changed. Another one, type D, changing the verb from first person plural to third person plural. Here another one, changing a verb from second person plural to third person plural. 23 instances where this was found. Another one, changing from masculine to feminine. Is it will benefit masculine versus it will benefit feminine? And of course, this would, depending on who is speaking and who it's referring to. Another one, a 10th one, is changing a statement to a command. 6 instances. He said, say, he said. So this is the imperative. And this is why kala is very, you have many of these kala to kul. Dan Brubaker brings this up in his variations and his changes that he's found in his work on the Quran. And then 11th kind is no changing of meaning, a different letter for a conjunction or with a similar meaning. The prophet versus the prophet, yet the writing, the letter is different. I just want to show you this picture. These are just a picture from Speaker's Corner when we held up the 26 different Qurans. But what I really want to do is I want to zero in on the Hafs text, because the Hafs text is the one that was finally chosen. This is our present Qiraat. This is the one, the Qiraat, that was chosen as the official one. Remember the 10 readers? Those are the 10 readers. You notice that the 20 transmitters, that's where you finally get Hafs. And it was Hafs that was chosen amongst the transmitters. He died in 796. But was he a good choice? Did it make sense that he should have been chosen? Let's go ahead and find out, because I believe he was not. Here's why. So let's go. Now, I have 5 problems with Hafs. First of all, he was not trustworthy and therefore not suitable. Secondly, he was not chosen for textual veracity or authenticity, but for political reasons. He came from the wrong city, another big problem. Fourth, he came with the wrong dialect. And fifth, he should have been the last person among the 30 to have been chosen. Why they chose him, I'll never know, but let's get into it. But however, before we get to Hafs, we need to start with Asim, his reader. This is the teacher. This is the family from which he derived his text from. Asim ibn Abi al-Najud is his name. He died in 745. We are told that he received his Quran from Zar ibn Hubaysh Abu Abd al-Rahman al-Sulami. Man, I'm glad I don't have long names like that. And then the other name that we're going to come after, you can read it, who supposedly received it from Ali ibn Abi Talib, who's the 4th caliph, and Ibn Masud from Kufa. So he got his from Kufa from Ibn Masud. That's very important, because we'll get into that later. Ibn Sa'd said, though, of Asim that he was liable, but made mistakes in the transmission. Abba ibn Ahmed said, Al-Almas memorized the tradition more correctly than Asim. Yaqub bin Sufyan said his transmission of the tradition contains some confusion. Ibn Ulayya said everyone named Asim was faulty in memorizing the text or the tradition. Ibn Kharas said about Asim, his transmission of the tradition contains some deniable things. Al-Ukaili had this to say about him. He had no problem with Asim except poor memorization of the tradition. Al-Darakutni said Asim had a fault of memory. And finally, Hamad al-Salma, Asim became confused towards the end of his life. So it's obvious that these people didn't have much trust in Asim. Nonetheless, he was chosen by our good friend Ibn Mujahid. Now, hold on a minute. Who was Ibn Mujahid, and why was he given this authority? Ibn Mujahid was the official Quranic expert in the 10th century. And anybody that stood against Ibn Mujahid, we're told by Nasser, was jailed, they were beaten up, and they were, many of them were actually, I don't think anybody was killed, but they were beaten, and many of them were persecuted because they stood against Mujahid. So Mujahid was the official. That's why he was the one that chose Asim. But it looks like he shouldn't have chosen Asim, because Asim was not considered to be very authoritative by these scholars here. How about Hafs? What do we know about Hafs? Well, we know that Hafs was raised by Asim there in Kufa. He himself said that he did not depart from Asim's reading except in one word, in Surah 4:30, Ayah 54. We know that that is not true. They have lots of differences between Hafs and Asim, but that's what he said of himself. Al-Dahabi says Hafs was reliable in his reading, consistent and accurate, but not so in the transmission of the tradition. Ibn Abi Hatim says his transmission of the tradition was rejected. Why? Because, according to Uthman al-Darimi, he was not reliable. Ibn al-Madini, Hafs was weak in the tradition. I intentionally avoided transmitting from him. Al-Bukhari even says he was rejected by the compilers of the biographical dictionaries. And Al-Nasai says, I consider him untrustworthy, and the traditions he transmitted were not recorded. Well, that's not all. There are other opinions. Take a look at Al-Daraqutni. He declared him to be weak. Al-Saji said Hafs is one of those whose traditions have disappeared. What he transmitted contained objectionable traditions. Salih Muhammad said his traditions were not recorded and all of them were objectionable. Ibn Kharash said of Hafs he was a liar and was rejected for fabricating traditions. Ibn Hayim said he used to change the chains of transmission and even fabricated chains for those traditions that did not have ones. So you can see the conclusions. Hafs was unreliable, he was weak, he was untrustworthy, contained objectionable material, contained fabricated chains, his traditions disappeared, he was a liar, his transmissions were not recorded by others, and others avoided him, so much so that Abd al-Rahman al-Mudi declared, I solemnly declare that it is not permissible to transmit traditions on Hafs' authority. Not the most resounding of support. So why was Hafs chosen as the official Quran if he was so unreliable and so untrustworthy? Well, we need to look and see how Hafs was canonized and where it all happened. You need to do that. You need to go back to the last century. You need to go back to 1924, 96 years ago. There in Cairo, just the city of Cairo, this was not for the whole world, this is just one city in Cairo. They were having troubles because they were having standardized tests at the high school level in the high schools, and they were getting so many different answers on the Qurans because they had at that time 30 different Qurans. So they were getting 30 different answers. You cannot have standardized tests with such a multiplicity of different answers. So there was a dilemma, there was a crisis. And they went to Al-Azhar University, and they went to Muhammad ibn Ali al-Husayni al-Haddad, who was there at Al-Azhar, considered to be probably the most influential Islamic university in the world. And they asked him to choose one amongst the 30, which he did. And he chose Hafs, who was a transmitter from Asim's family, who lived in Kufa in Iraq, who died in 796. And they chose him as the authoritative one for all the schools there in Cairo, in Cairo. The other 29 variant Qurans that were being used by these students were gathered together. They took them out into a boat and they threw them into the Nile River and sank them, thinking that would get rid of the problem. They got rid of the other 29 and only kept one. So now we're back to one Quran. This is the fifth stage that Shadi Nasr talks about. This is the fifth stage of canonization. They took one, chose it, Hafs, threw out the other 29. Little did they know that you can still buy them even today. I've already got, you can see right here, I've got 8 of them right behind me here. Hatun has 37 of them. Our good old friend Bernie Powers there in Australia has 23 of them. My friend Qadhi has 10 of them. And you can see from just looking at 23 of them, we're 93,000 differences, 93,263 at last count, differences with Hafs that I've circled in black. But Hafs, hold on a minute, even Hafs has differences. Which Hafs Quran are we talking about? There are 7 different Hafs Quran. Hatun sent me this picture. Number them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Those are all Hafs. Not one of them is the same. Even Hafs, she has collected 7 different Hafs Quran. So which is the one we use today? Oh, it just gets better and better. That was for Cairo. In 1936, because of the success of their exercise there in Cairo, they decide to make Hafs the official text for all of Egypt. That was in 1936, so about 12 years later. There were many differences. In fact, between 1924 and 1936, they meant about 5 to 6, some say as many as 7 changes in the Hafs text, so it made it more readable. They decided to make this the standard text for all Egyptian schools all over Egypt. And this was known as the Farouk edition, named after King Farouk, who came to power in that year. Now, in 1985, because of the success of that model in Egypt, the Saudi Arabian government, they're looking at this, said, hold on a minute, and King Fahd said, if they're having that much success there in Egypt, let's make this for the whole world. So in 1985, they call it the Fahd edition, named after King Fahd, made Hafs the official text for all the world. That's only 35 years ago. King Fahd came to power in 1982, but he made this decision in 1985. So this decision to make Hafs the canonical text for all the world is only 35 years. That's it. That's it. Not very long ago. Whoa, wait a minute. Let's back up. Let's back up. Remember al-Bukhari. This I talked about many times. I didn't do it in this lecture, but you've seen this before. Remember, that's looking at al-Bukhari, volume 6, hadith number 510. That's the story about how the Uthmanic Quran came together. And in 510, it's very clear that well, it starts with 509, the hadith before that. And it says that Abu Bakr, there was a big battle up in Yamama, and about 70 of the reciters, those who had memorized it, died in that battle. And they came back to Abu Bakr and they said, we've got a problem here, because if many more of these reciters die, we're going to lose the Quran, because they have it in their head. And when they die, the Quran dies with them. So he took Zayd ibn Thabit, the secretary of Muhammad, to come and write the Quran, write it down. And remember, right there in 509, Zayd ibn Thabit did not want to write it down. He was very clear that this is something the Prophet did not even do. He could not do that. Nonetheless, Abu Bakr and Umar insisted he do so, so he did. He wrote it down. And he took it from bones, stones, pieces of bark, and people's memory. Now let's jump to 510 that we're looking at here. In 510, 20 years later, Uthman's now in power. So now we're talking about 652. And this is where you have this battle, another battle. So the first battle was Battle of Yamama in 632. Now we're at the Battle of Azerbaijan in 652, 20 years later, way up north. And you have these Iraqis and the Syrians who are battling alongside the Muslims from the Hijaz, from Arabia. And they're hearing different Qurans, and they get upset. They come to blows. Hudayfa comes back down to Uthman and says, we've got a problem here. We've got to do something. And there you can read right there. Read it. I'm just giving you a snapshot of what's written there in English on the left side. And he says, we've got a problem. We don't want to have many different Qurans like the Christians and Jews. Let's make it into one text. Make it in the Qurayshi dialect. And that's what Uthman does. He chooses Zayd ibn Thabit, the same guy that wrote the first one, told him to get the Hafsa copy, the one that was given to Hafsa, the wife of Muhammad, who is the daughter of Umar. She stuck it under her bed for 20 years. They're to get that copy, to bring it up, to use that copy as their model, to rewrite the Quran. He's going to give him 3 men to help them. They're all his son-in-laws. So therefore, they were qualified because they were his son-in-laws. And they were to rewrite the Quran in the Qurayshi dialect. Remember, the Qurayshi dialect, just one dialect. And that's the dialect that is known in Hijaz. That's the dialect that Muhammad would have used. That would be the dialect that exists in heaven. So they did so. Zayd ibn Thabit did that, gave it to Uthman. He then took all the other dialects and he destroyed them. And which are the ones that he destroyed? Which are the ones he destroyed? Hold on a minute. Here, I'm just giving it to you. I actually ran ahead of myself. He took all the other copies, all the ones from Kufa, from Basra, and from Damascus. Those are the ones up north. Took them all, and he burned them. There it is, right there. Read it. You can see it. It's there in the Arabic. There it is in English. He burned them. Why? Because he only wanted one Quran to be left behind. Only one Quran, and that would be the Qurayshi Quran. The Qurayshi Quran. The Qurayshi Quran. So where were the corrupted Qurans from? Let's remind ourselves. Remember, which cities did they come from? Well, let's now look at 5 copies were sent to 5 different cities: Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo. Sorry, not Jerusalem. You have Mecca, Medina, Basra, Kufa, and Damascus. Those are the 5 cities, 5 different copies, with each one with its own reader, and all in the Qurayshi dialect, right? But then remember, we talked about Ubay ibn Ka'b. He had 116. Then we had talked about Ibn Masud. He had 110. Ibn Musa had 114. That left about 114 with Zayd ibn Thabit. So the corrupted Qurans were all from Basra, Kufa, and Damascus. That's from Iraq and Syria. That's why I have them in red. That's where the corrupted Qurans were. That's why Uthman had them all burned and replaced with the Qurayshi dialect. So let's ask this question. How many of the 10 readers use the Qureshi dialect? How many of the 10 readers that you see there, those are the official 10, how many of them use the Qureshi dialect? Well, here we go. So we know that Nafi was from Medina, so he would be Qureshi. Ibn Kathir is from Mecca, he would be Qureshi. And Abu Jafar. That means only 3 out of the 10 readers were Qureshi. They're the ones I have in yellow there. Are you following that? How many of the 20 transmitters, the Rawis, were Qureshi? Well, Qalun, he was Qureshi. Warsh was not. Al-Bazi was Qureshi. Gunbul was Qureshi. Isa ibn Wardan was Qureshi. And Ibn Jumaz was Qureshi. So, only 5 out of the 20 were from Quraysh, were from the Hijaz. Which means out of the 30 official qira'ats, only 8 use the Qurayshi dialect. 8. The other 22 were all from Iraq and Syria, the places that were corrupted, right? Including Hafs. Hafs was not Qurayshi. He was from the stable of Asim, who is from Kufa, which is just below Baghdad, which is in Iraq. That's hundreds of miles north, and hundreds of years later, he wrote his in 796. Can you see why I'm bringing this up? What's interesting, his dialect is part of the dialects that were destroyed by Uthman, were burned by Uthman. So why in the world did they choose Hafs? Let's now get into our conclusions and put it all together. So, what can we conclude? Well, number 1, Muslims are forced to say that the Quran is perfectly preserved because of surahs 10, 15, 59, 18, 27. 10, 15, and 18, 27 says the Quran cannot change. 59 says God protects it. That's why it cannot change. Modern scholars, however, make claims that they cannot hope to support. Remember, they're the ones that say that there's not one letter, not one word that has changed. Yes, Qadhi says that. Some even say as much as not even a diacritical mark can change. Their claims are wreaking havoc with Muslim communities post June 8th. Since that interview, it's causing all kinds of havoc, because when they keep making these claims that there's not one word or letter change, can you see the dilemma that is for these scholars who are being asked, people like Muhammad Hijab, how can you say this? What are you going to write on this Quran? Which is this one that you're going to put on the Quran that is a blank one? There never has been just one Quran, and certainly not any from the 7th century. The fact that Arabic could not even accommodate a written text so early needs to be acknowledged. How could Muhammad receive 7 recitations, that means 7 dialects, if he only lived in Mecca, Medina? Because of the 7, remember, only 2 of them are from his area. The other 5 are all from Iraq and Syria. He never was in Iraq, and he never was in Syria. So how could he even receive these 7 recitations? Obviously, these 7 recitations that were chosen by Ibn Mujahid in the 10th century are not the 7 that the Muslims talk about that Muhammad was referring to, that he got from Jibril. If there was a canonical Qurayshi Quran in 652, where is it today? 5 were sent to 5 different cities. Why can't we even find 1? Where is this Qurayshi Quran? As we're going to see in 2 weeks, Quraysh does not even make sense. There's no such thing as a Qurayshi dialect. Ooh, I love it, but that's for later. Furthermore, where are the 5 Qurayshi copies sent to Medina, Mecca, Basra, and Kufa? I just asked that. I'm just repeating myself. So that's the 7th question. And number 8, what has happened to Ubay ibn Ka'b, Ibn Masud, and Ibn Muslim? See, these are the other 3 that are above and beyond the Qurayshi ones that don't even agree. They have 116 surahs or 111 surahs. They don't even have the same number of surahs, to say nothing of the fact that these are, and what we're talking about, these surahs and what we're talking about with them, these are the razm, these are the skeletal texts that are differences. The 8th century Qira'at Qurans only begin to appear over 100 years after Muhammad died. This proves they never knew Muhammad, nor even worked in his century. They didn't even live in his, well, they were born in his century, but they were just little infants in the same century that Muhammad lived. So they knew nothing about Muhammad. They never heard a word he said. They never knew any of his renditions, his 7. Further conclusions. They were chosen even later, between 936 and 1429. That means 300 to 800 years later. Here's the question I'd like to ask. Where are their manuscripts? We don't have any of their manuscripts. So the 8th century Qira'ats cannot be the same as the Jibril 7th century recitations. Are you getting that? That's kind of confusing. The 7 that are chosen by Ibn Mujahid in the 8th century They cannot be the same as the 7 that Jibril supposedly gave Muhammad in the 7th century. Are you following that? That's Muslims are always confusing that. Do not let them. There's 100 years between them. Since Uthman destroyed the Iraqi and Syrian recitation, why do they suddenly appear in the 8th century? If they've all been destroyed, and the Qurayshi the Qurayshi dialect is sent to those 5 cities with 5 different readers to make sure that they didn't get corrupted, how is it within 100 years they all got corrupted? And more than that, they all mostly start coming from Kufa, from Iraq. Ooh, I love that. Why are only 8 of the 30 official qira'ats from the areas the Qurayshi would have existed, the Hijaz? We now find that there were many more than 30 qira'ats. There may be possibly as many as 700. It's curious that the qira'ats were primarily chosen because of popularity and geography, and I would also say family connections. Shouldn't a rawi or transmitter have the same script as his reader in order to be legitimate? See, that's a huge question I'd like to ask. If you have a student who is in your stable, who has been taught by you, shouldn't you have the same Quran that the teacher has? The fact that they have completely different Qurans shows me that there's something wrong in the textual critical analysis. Each wrote their own script, with now 93,000 differences that we have found in just 23. We haven't even looked at all 30 yet. Not one of the Qira'at Qurans, the ones that come after, had any textual critical analysis like what has been done to the Bible. They didn't even look to see if they were the same. They didn't even care if they were the same. They just want to know where they came from, and they just want to know how many transmitters, how many students they had after them. The most popular were the ones that were chosen, and the cities, certain cities like Cairo, was the one that was chosen. It had nothing to do with textual criticism or whether or not even the text was the same. No one has tried to find the earliest manuscript to use as a model. No one has looked at the text of any of the subsequent Qira'at Qurans. We're the first to do so. And you notice they are not doing what we're doing. You need to look and see the differences. That's why Shah bin Ali says there's no difference in meaning. There's no difference in theology. They are all saying the same thing because he's never done any of the work. He hasn't looked at the 93,000 differences. He only knew about chapter 98, verse 3, chapter 98, verse 6, because we put it up on a video. That's the only reason he even did a video on it. And he tried his best to try to say, oh, this is still all the same meaning. Al-Fadi just destroyed him in the video we put up. That's the problem with scholarship today. Still further conclusions. The Hafs, the canonical Qira'at, was not a member of the first 7, nor of the subsequent 10. That's hugely significant. If he was so great that he was now the canonical text for all the world today, chosen in 1924 and then authorized in 1985, why was he not part of the original 10, the 10 readers from the 8th and 9th century? He was unreliable, he was weak, he was untrustworthy and a liar. He used objectionable material and fabricated change so that others avoided him and he refused to use them. That's why others refused to use him. He was initially chosen in order to standardize high school exams in the Quran, but only in Cairo. He was chosen for political purposes. The reason he was chosen by Muhammad ibn al-Husayni al-Haddad in 1924 was because the Ottomans had chosen. He was the favorite of the Ottomans. It was for political reasons. And in 1924, though they got their independence at that time, and the British did control them at that time, sorry, not the independence, the British did control Egypt at that time. Theologically speaking, Muhammad ibn al-Husayni ibn al-Haddad was still under the authority of the Ottomans as far as theological authority. And that's why he went with the Ottomans. He didn't even look at the text. He didn't even do a comparison of the text with that of the earliest manuscripts. And the reason he didn't do that because for him, it was nothing more than political exigency, expediency. He was chosen by the Saudi Arabian government 35 years ago, again, out of expediency. They wanted to do what the Egyptians had done. They didn't even look at the script. They had no idea what they're talking about. And here's what's fascinating. Why in the world did they choose Hafs? The Saudi Arabian government from Arabia, from Medina, from Mecca. Why didn't they choose a Qurayshi dialect? Why in the world did they not choose Nafi or Ibn Kathir or Abu Jafar? Those are Qurayshi. They didn't choose any of those 3. They chose Hafs, who was from Iraq. This would be the one time you would have thought that the Arabian government would have put their foot down and says, no, we need to go back to what it says in Al-Bukhari. We need to go back to what Uthman chose. We need to go back to that original Quran. We need to go back to the Qurayshi dialect. We need to come back to Mecca and Medina. We need to come home to our own country. No, they chose one from hundreds of miles away up in Kufa. Hugely significant because we're going to see in 2 weeks Everything begins in Kufa. It all begins there. Much of everything begins there, not just the Quran. Well, we'll see that later on. Nowhere in this whole process did anyone use textual criticism. In other words, the Hafs text, whether or not it was similar or even close to the original Uthmani Qureshi text, they didn't use that. The reason? There is no Uthmani Qureshi manuscript with which to compare. And today there still is no text. That's why there has been no textual critical analysis done to any of these Qurans. They don't know how to do it. They don't dare do it because there's nothing they can compare it with. The only thing they can compare it with now is this text, the Hafs text. The Hafs text. This one here, I have it upside down. This one here, this little guy, this little blue guy. Why? Because he was chosen because the Ottomans loved him. So finally, this is my last slide. From what we have researched and found, we can say, number one, the Quran was not created by God at all. Number two, the Quran was not sent down to Muhammad between 610 and 632. The Quran was not completed by Uthman in 652. The Quran was changed in the last 1300 years. You notice I'm saying 1300, not 1400, because I don't believe there was any Quran 1400 years ago. It looks like it only begins to appear with these guys that I have here, with Ibn Amir. I'm sorry. Yeah. Ibn Amir in 736. Thus, the Quran is a mere 90, no, wait a minute, only 35 years old. Consequently, many of us here who are listening to me are older than the Quran. Okay, that's the end of this lecture. Now, I just end with this last little tidbit. By casting doubt on the Quran, our Muslim friends can consider a better book, the Bible. Let's bring them home.